stars, I will be there.
I'm Monica Charette, and this is Holding the Light.
As long as you love, I will whisper in your ear. Little whispers you will hear. As long as you love.
On today's episode of Holding the Light, we are joined by a fellow bereaved mother who will share how losing her son 5 years ago reshaped her life and led her to advocate for change. She's also Mrs. Maine, someone who chose to carry her grief into the public eye, not for attention, but for impact. This conversation is about love, loss, courage, and what happens when a grieving mom decides to turn her grief into purpose. Colby and I are holding the light with Jessica Ashe. Today's conversation is one that sits right at the intersection of love, loss, and leadership. Our guest is a mother who lost her son in a car accident 5 years ago, a day that forever changed her life. She is also Mrs. Maine, a woman who chose not to hide her grief, but to carry it into the public eye with courage and purpose. So thank you, Jessica, for joining us and being willing to share your story today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We want to talk about how you used your platform to educate others and advocate for change. But before we talk about advocacy or titles, I want to start where love begins. Tell us about your son, Nicholas, who he was and what you loved most about him.
Absolutely. It's my favorite thing to talk about. Nicholas was just such a kind human being. When I started my platform, Light in the Dark, the light comes specifically from Nick and who he was. He was the kid that just made friends with everybody, moved through this world, never letting the opinions of anybody affect him. He showed up exactly who he was. He's everything that I've ever wanted to be. He was an amazing big brother to my other 3 sons, Benjamin, Braden, and Nathan. He had a wonderful, eclectic group of friends that are still so dear to me and still show up in our lives. So we're so fortunate for them too. And I just think that's a testament to who Nick was, because the type of people that he chose to surround himself with were equally amazing.
He sounds amazing, and I can see where it comes from.
Thank you.
We know Nick died in a very tragic accident. What do you remember about that day? Tell us what happened to Nick.
Sure. So that day, it was October 2nd, 2020. I remember it was a pretty typical Friday. I was at a new job, but I didn't feel well most of the day, which was, kind of bizarre looking in hindsight. I just had this feeling all day like something didn't feel right. And I got out of work at 3 p.m. and decided to lay down and take a nap, which I don't typically do. And within just a few minutes of starting to doze off, my dog started, barking and growling at the window. And when I got up to see who was there, it was a state trooper. When he came to my door, it never even crossed my mind why he might be there. And he asked me if I was alone. And I said, no, should I be? And my other boys are downstairs. Do they need to leave? And he said, no, ma'am, but is your son Nicholas Karen? And I still didn't realize what was happening. And it was more of like a, yes, oh my goodness, did he do something wrong? And that's when he told me, there's no easy way to say this, ma'am, but he was in an accident today and he did not survive.
Oh, you remember word for word, don't you?
Yes. And I replay it in my head frequently. It's something I can never unsee. I remember what that officer looks like. It was 2020, so he was wearing an American flag mask across his face. Those things are ingrained in us forever. Within minutes of him telling me that news, I sat down on my steps and I could hear my other boys, hysterically crying downstairs. And I just thought to myself, the light cannot go out in mom today. And that's the recurring phrase. It's how I carry myself. It's what my platform is built on. Nick's light needs to shine through me so that the rest of my family can survive this loss.
What was it like, your own grief in the beginning? Because you did have to support your other grieving children.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, Honestly, I probably suppressed a lot of it. It was like you pull up your bootstraps and you do what you have to do. I went back to work after the first week of, planning Nick's services and hosting his funeral. And that Monday, I was back at it. But over time, I allowed myself to feel it in my own private moments because that's what worked best for me. I've certainly done lots of therapy and just found ways to honor his legacy. And for me, that's been the biggest thing to help me put one foot in front of the other, is carrying Nick with me and keeping his memory alive.
Have you experienced grief before the passing of your son?
Not in any type of intense way. I mean, I had lost my grandparents that I wasn't super close with. Nick was my first true experience with grief. And then, unfortunately, 2 short years later, I ended up losing my mom in a, pretty traumatic and quick way. She died of a very aggressive cancer in like 12 days from her diagnosis. So we've really been hit with it around here.
So your son has been gone for 5 years. What surprises you most about how grief has changed, or maybe it stayed the same for you?
I guess the most surprising thing sometimes is just knowing that you can still be standing. I think before we ever lose a child, every mother has this stance of if anything ever happens to my child, I could never go on.
We've all said that.
Yeah, like, if something happens to one of the boys, put me, commit me because I cannot survive. But you do, and you can, and you're forever changed. The person that I was, the mother that I was before Nick's passing, she's gone. But you can still survive. You still can find joy throughout the hard moments, even when you think there's no way you possibly could.
How did you approach discussing Nick's passing to your other sons? And how did you go about parenting them through their grief?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, the boys overheard everything in the first, moments of the officer telling me. My two middle boys, Ben and Braden, they were about 16 at the time. And then we had to share the news with my youngest, who was only 9 at the time, and that was terrible. He had come home from a friend's house, and we said, we all have something to tell you, and Nick was in an accident today. And I remember him looking at us and saying, and he died? Like he just knew. And he said, I wish you didn't have to tell me that.
Yeah, that's so hard, isn't it?
Yeah. But the biggest thing I've done to support the boys is just give them a really open and safe place within our home and beyond to talk about Nick. Like he's never off topic. We talk about him and share his memories all the time. We celebrate, his birthday every single year. We also gather on his death anniversary every single year. That's been the best way for us to just support each other and to just keep Nick's memory constantly in the forefront.
What do you do on those memorial days?
We've done a lot of different things. The very first year, we had like a big barbecue and a fire because that's what Nick loved. All of our friends and family came, his friends. We had a fire at our house, and then at night we lit paper lanterns that had messages to him, and we sent them up, which was beautiful. We've had other years where we got together and played mini golf as a family and went to lunch. His 21st birthday, we had a little party and we all took a shot in his honor. And then this past year, we actually met at the ocean, which Nick loved to be at the beach. And I think water is healing for all of us. And we went there at sunset and lit lanterns that, went in the sand and just talked about him and allowed ourselves to feel all of those emotions.
I love that. I love how people find their own personal way to remember people that they've lost. But at some point, Jessica, your grief shifted from something you were surviving to something you were using to create change. And I know that you're a fierce advocate for longer bereavement time for families who have experienced loss. I'm a big fan of this. So let's talk about that. What is the average leave time for bereavement, and what are you proposing?
Excellent question. So, the current bereavement leave, or the average bereavement leave in the state of Maine and nationwide, is only 3 days. And if your company is really generous, you might get 5. I would love to see mandated leave nationwide, not only in our state, that you have to allow at least probably 8 to 10 days. I would also like to see that bereavement leave be flexible. I think in the beginning, we're all in survival mode, and those first 10 days are not necessarily enough for us to feel everything we need to feel and move on. So maybe you take a few days in the beginning, but then on their anniversary later that year, you need more time off to process that. And I just think not only firm policy around bereavement leave, but it's also my mission to educate other human resources professionals on how they can implement programs within their organizations to truly support employees that are going through loss like this.
Yeah, what does that look like, though, for employers?
So, for me, I've been speaking at human resources associations across the state of Maine right now. And it just looks at like educating managers on being empathetic, understanding that people walking through your doors every day are all carrying an invisible load that nobody can see. And there's truth in the statistics that if you support your employees, not only monetarily, but emotionally, in their overall well being as a human, they're more likely to be productive and they're more likely to stay. I think it's important to have things like wellness rooms at your facilities when available, where somebody can go sit in the quiet, take 10 minutes, feel through a hard moment, and come back to work. And sometimes those really small changes make a huge ripple effect across organizations.
I completely agree. I think sometimes, at least in terms of like modern politics and things, you hear stuff about like, school lunches being on the docket. And it's like, well, how can a kid learn without being fed? How can somebody work when they're not being met where they're at? How can they possibly contribute to your company while they're going through this immense grief? We have to meet people as humans where they're at, regardless of their employment or who or what they do in their personal lives. Ultimately, if they're suffering, they're not going to contribute. And we have to get them out of that space and into a place where they feel comfortable to work again and to love and to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I always say for myself as a human resources professional, I like the human part of human resources. For me, it's not all about policy and rules, but exactly like you said, Colby, meeting people where they're at and knowing that a lot of times a lack in performance, or if you're just talking real world, the way that some people come across ugly or grumpy or rude, there's often so much more behind that. And I think if everyone can choose to look through a lens of kindness and compassion, we often see that there's so much more to what people are showing us on the outside.
What can people do, Jessica, if they want to support this policy or in Maine or in their own state? What can they do to get involved?
Right now, I don't have anything in the works as far as taking it like to the Senate or anything like that. But I would say starting right within your own workplaces, starting to bring up these conversations, go to your leadership team, brainstorm ideas. And if anyone is listening wants assistance with that, I would be more than happy to come out and speak to leadership teams, offer suggestions or write ups that you can share. But small acts are what end up leading to big change.
Well, you've certainly turned your grief into a personal mission to help others know there is life after child loss. When did you realize your grief could be used as a platform for education and policy change, not just your own personal healing?
So I think when my United States of America's pageant director, Christy Hines, reached out to me, I was in kind of a pivotal time of my grief. I was feeling very judgmental of the way that I was carrying things. And that was something that was true to my grief journey as a whole. If I wasn't judging how well or how unwell I was doing at my grief, I felt like somebody else was. And she had seen some of my posts on Facebook where I kind of used it as a blog just to talk about Nick and my journey and how I was getting through. And she said, "Have you ever considered competing in a pageant?" And truthfully, initially, I was like, absolutely not. I am 40 years old at the time. I've birthed 4 children. Like, nobody wants to see me in a swimsuit on a stage. And she said, truthfully, it's about so much more than that. And you have a story that needs to be heard. And the story of your son and your grief can be your platform. So I sat down that night and I thought it over and I was like, I always wanted a way to honor Nick. And I had looked at things like scholarships, podcasts, all the various ways that people do things. I had thought about starting my own grief organization. And then I thought, you know what? I can just use my voice to amplify the services that are already available to people. And this can be my push to combine my HR experience and this pageant platform to really start making change for bereavement leave. So when I knew that Nick could be at the forefront of this, that was really the big shift for me.
I'm so curious to know, how do you kind of balance honoring Nick's memory without feeling like you're turning him into a cause?
That's a good question. I've never really looked at it that way, but I have worried that in the process of trying to honor him through this, it sometimes feels selfish for me because while it's his light that's driving this, I'm the one on the stage. So that's something that I've had to kind of navigate and just remind myself this truly is about Nick. And not only does this change help other people, but Nicholas always wanted the best for me. He was my first child, born to me at age 18, and then I had 18 years with him before he passed, but we really grew up together. And he was just such a cheerleader for me to have good things in my life that I just know all of this coming together, it is about him without a doubt, and I just know he's cheering me on.
I love that. And I ask you that with so much respect because someone has actually asked me that before. So I thought that's a very interesting question to think about.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's hard because, again, I think it comes back to that feeling of judgment sometimes. It's like I had celebrated Nicholas's birthday one year and, my own mom, God rest her soul, she called me up that morning and checked in to see what we were doing for the day. And she's like, well, you're doing awfully good today. And it was like, well, it's his birthday. I bought someone a cake in his honor and we're going to celebrate him today. But then I questioned, am I doing too okay? Am I not remembering him in the right way? And, all of these thoughts seep in and we just don't need that as grieving parents, as grieving humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I have had those feelings myself before. So you're about to compete in the national level. Tell us about that. That sounds very exciting.
It is exciting, also terrifying, but I'm heading to Las Vegas at the end of March to compete in the United States of America's national pageant. So I will be specifically competing to be United States of America's Misses. When we go there, we do an interview with 5 judges, and our interview is actually the largest part of our score. So it's talking specifically about our platform, about our community service, about the change that we're making. And then we also take the stage in a gown and a swimsuit, and that's part of our score as well. But I really just hope more than anything that Nick shines through on the stage and with those judges. And I hope that they really hear the change that I have the potential to make with this push for changed bereavement leave and changed policies and changed compassion within our organizations. If I could speak beyond Maine and spread this nationwide and see a change across the whole United States, how cool would that be?
Well, like you said, it takes small actions, and I'm just so inspired by anybody who can start at the baseline and work up. And it sounds like you've created a foundation, and it's an amazing and inspiring story. Really kind of hone in on something that is so human for every person, regardless of their background, to have that opportunity to grieve and to give them that space to heal. So I love this so much as somebody who I talk so much to my friends and my family about how you can get mad about the system, and you should be, but you can make change within your life and your neighbor's life. I love that you are going to have this platform to be able to do that larger now.
Thank you, Colby. I appreciate that a lot. I think that ties in with one of my favorite quotes, and I actually put this on my judge's biography is if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. And I think that's the first place that all of this starts. And, when you talked about my boys and how I've supported them, I think giving them a place to know that they can wear their emotions on their sleeve, even though they're men, even though they're in the military, it's safe to feel and to grieve however you need to grieve. And when they're touched in that way, every person that they interact with is going to be touched in that way. And hopefully that just continues to spread.
This experience must be so healing for your own grief.
It is in a way. And at the same time, sometimes it feels very heavy too, because I'm reliving it constantly as I talk about Nick. It's very bittersweet, I guess. I always want to talk about his name and his memory, but it's also a daily reminder of the pain that I live with. And sometimes it's hard to be so vulnerable in such a public space as well.
Well, as a fellow bereaved mother, I know how much energy it takes just to exist, let alone advocate. So I applaud what you're doing. How has losing your son reshaped what motherhood means to you today? Are things different 5 years later?
Absolutely. My 4 children have always been at the forefront of everything I do and my most important priority. But what's really shifted is taking the time for the smallest things. So, for example, my boys love to have their back tickled. And there were a lot of days when I'd come home from work exhausted and I've cooked dinner and they'd be like, tickle my back. And it's like, oh, Nick, not right now. Or, Ben, I'll do it later. And I don't pause those things anymore because you live with this, what if I had rubbed Nick's back that last time before the day he got into his car accident? You don't let them leave the house after a frustrated morning on the way to school. We take the time, Nathan and I, my youngest, to get Dunkin' Donuts. It's really just savoring those intimate, tiny moments with them that, God forbid, something should ever happen to another one of them. I never want to be left with a regret about how I mothered them.
How do you define a meaningful life now, knowing that joy and sorrow can coexist?
I think I see a lot more in the value of contentment. It really is the smallest things that matter. It's not always about the money you have or the trips you take or the job you have. It's just having a safe, warm home with your children in it becomes everything you could ever need. That's your definition of rich. That's my definition of rich. When I have the fortunate nights that my 3 living children are here in my home and their heads are on their pillows in my house, there is no greater joy than that to me.
How are the boys doing?
Honestly, amazing. They're incredibly resilient and just thriving. Something that we hadn't talked about is Nicholas had actually sworn into the Air Force just days before his accident, and he was preparing to leave for boot camp for active duty Air Force. So Benjamin and Braden, my twins, have now joined the Air National Guard and, are really kind of following in his footsteps, and that allows them to honor him as well. One of my boys is also swearing into the Windham Police Department next week, so, he's beginning his whole journey. And then my 14-year-old Nathan he's a great kid. He's a perfect blend of all 3 of his older brothers, filled with Nick's compassion and quirkiness, but like athletic and outgoing like his other brothers. And they're just doing amazingly well. It amazes me how resilient they can be.
I love how they're each finding their own way to honor their brother and probably will always continue to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
For a mother early in loss, and I get this question a lot, who can't imagine 5 years from now, what would you gently tell that mother?
I would say that as impossible as it feels to see a life ahead of this loss, that it is possible. Your grief changes you. You don't have to allow it to define you. You find ways to carry on, to keep your child's memory, and you grow around the grief. It's forever engraved in you, but you can survive and you can find joy again. You have to look for the brightest part in any day, wherever you can find it. And there's always hope on the other side of the darkest days.
Well, grief can still feel heavy on some days. I'm sure that you still experience that. How do you find the means to keep shining his light?
I think for me personally, time alone is what is best for me. I definitely find when I'm around my husband or my other children, I go into more of a survival mode, and it's not even something I can control. Even in the first days after Nick's accident, I felt like I couldn't cry around my other children. And so for me, if I get in my car and I'm traveling for work or going on a long drive, that's where I can allow myself to kind of let my breath out for a minute, put on some music that reminds me of Nick, and just really like let it out and feel the things I need to feel. And when I honor myself by taking that time, I'm able to return to my family just a more present mother and a more present wife.
This has been such an enlightening conversation, Jessica. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. In closing, we want to give you the opportunity how you want the world to remember your son, Nick.
I would just say, please remember him as a kind, gentle, shining light. Just remember that he was a friend to everybody. People came out of the woodwork to share different stories of how he had touched them and supported them. And sometimes, though he was my child that I worried the most about, he was actually the one probably thriving out of all of them. So I would just say, in this world, be true to yourself and be kind to others and live like Nick C., which is what we like to live by around here.
Well, Jessica, you remind us that grief does not end our capacity to lead, and it just deepens it. Your voice is really changing lives, and your son's life continues to matter through the love and courage you carry forward. So thank you so much for trusting us with your story and with Nick's story.
Thank you so much for having me on today. It was so nice to talk with both of you.
As long as you love.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this podcast helpful, please share our link with others and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. I'm Monica Charette, reminding you that you are never alone in your grief. Until next time, we'll be right here with you, holding the light.
As long as you